we'll cover all those at the end. So I want to introduce my two guests who are going to help today. They're far more experienced at this process than I am. The first is Ed Cotton, whom I've known probably for about 15 years. We met because we were both really excited about this kind of new era of marketing that was taking off in the 2000s. With sort of the combination of advertising and technology and marketing and social media. Anyway, I've learned a lot from Ed. Ed, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so my background, I'm a brand consultant right now, and I've been doing that for the last 4 and a bit years. For a long time, I was the chief strategy officer of an agency called Butler Shine Stern and Partners, located in Sausalito, California, in the heart of mountain bike
Lunch
country.
is served. Rumi.
Okay, keep going, Ed. And please mute yourself if you're not muted already. Thank you.
So yeah, I do, I've done my own focus groups, moderated, hired people to do them, probably been involved in thousands of pieces of qualitative research in my career, and know a reasonable amount, but I don't know everything, but I know a bit. And that's me.
Great. Thanks, Ed. And our other expert who's joining us today is Yves Ejsmont. And one of the things that's amazing about Yves, one of my clients says when I do customer research work, he's like, hey, Peter, you're like an anthropologist. And well, Yves actually has a master's degree in anthropology. I loved that so much. So anyway, Yves, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. It's nice to meet you. I'm Yves Ejsmont, currently in Chicago. And as Peter mentioned, my training is in anthropology from the University of Chicago, and have been working in first user experience for about 5 years, and then transitioning into qualitative market research, and currently representing further and further a research firm specializing in ethnographic qualitative research. So the qualiest of the qual. So very excited to be here and share whatever I can. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thank you. Okay, just before we get into the questions, I just want to recognize some of the people here. Some are longtime friends, some I have not met, but just a few of the people that we've got in the room here are, we've got Tim Bomba and Steve Fleck, a couple endurance sports announcers I have known for years. We have Grace Williams, a professional cyclist with the Siniska cycling team. We have Lindsay Cowsley is here, Patrick Rizzo, whom I've known through the running community for years. We have Pedro Lopez from London is here, Scott Brogner, Roxy Lowe, the chief designer for Ibis Bicycles, and we have Susie Sanchez, who's with USA Cycling, the governing body of cycling, and also a couple students from the USC Marshall School of Business. Anyway, so all right, let's get to it. I want to cover the first question. I just want to ask Yves and Ed is, what is customer research and why do it?
So I kick this off? Yeah. Well, I mean, customer research is it's a huge topic. And there's a reason you want to understand something about your customers. You want to learn something. You may want to introduce a new product. You may want to know the state of your brand. You might want to know why something is happening. And really, there are two types. There's quantitative, which is all the data. It's about building a large enough sample of customers or prospects or whoever you want to talk to, and asking them a survey, fielding a survey and getting quantitative data back, which gives you sort of statistical data on the proportion of people who say a certain thing. How often, it could be a frequency of activity question. You want to know how often people cycle, how far they cycle. You may want to know why they cycle. So just that could be a usage and attitude study, and it maybe you could also measure your brand awareness, your brand perceptions, and your competitors. That would be a sort of a typical quantitative thing. And then you want to go further, and maybe you want to understand why you got some of the responses you did on your quantitative, and you want to go out and talk to people face to face or over Zoom or in chat rooms or however you choose, whatever forums, to get to the whys behind some of that data, and that's qualitative research, which is, I do both types of research. I've done a lot of both types, but I actually do moderation for focus groups and tend to do a lot of the qualitative myself. Whereas with quant, most of the time you could do a self-administered survey on something like SurveyMonkey, or you can hire a company that specializes in doing quant research to help. So that's a very 30,000 foot view.
So thanks, Ed. Ed's talking about the two major kinds of research that most people would understand are quantitative and qualitative. Quant being kind of like the data, large groups of, surveys, et cetera. Qualitative, which we're going to focus more on today, being more about why is somebody doing what they're doing. Is that right, Eve?
Yeah, I would say so. I think that was a great overview, Ed. And I think, generally consumer research, I mean, you can be seeking to understand something about the current environment in which the brand sits. It could be learning about the people themselves. So there's lots of different applications, and it really comes down to the question that you're trying to answer. And I think qualitative lends itself to your exact point, Peter, understanding the why, or the insight behind the insight, as we have further and further like to say, because people often can't articulate immediately why they do a certain thing. So it's important to really to map out not only their behavior, but the context of their lives to understand motivations, desires, needs, and really help triangulate where brands sit and why they do things for people. Because there's always a higher order human meaning behind all of it. It just takes a little bit of time and talking to people to unearth what that is.
Yeah. And I would say I'm amazed at how many clients I've had that say, oh, we know our customers. No, we're not, do we really need to do research? We absolutely know our customers. And I would say, yeah, I'm not sure about that. Let's find out. And I've never once undergone a research project and not learned something valuable and surprising from a set of, whether they're customers or partners. We'll get into later, like who you can do research with, because there are all kinds of different groups. And we'll get into insights later, but I love to start a marketing plan with, here are like 5 things we learned from your customers. Let's solve these problems that they need solved. Like it makes kind of like the getting started on a marketing plan much kind of simpler and more basic. Okay, Eve, I know you had a point of view, and Ed also, on before you start doing customer research, what are the sort of conversations you would have with your team at a business or your client if you're doing client work? What are the foundational kind of ground rules that you got to set out at the beginning?
Yeah, and I go back to your point, Peter, about sort of the marketing plan, the annual marketing plan. It could be a good time to sort of, when you're talking about budget, what kind of research do you want to do? So I think a discipline of bringing stakeholders into a room and asking them what questions they want answered. What do they know? Do they not know and want to know? Really sort of a generative brainstorming exercise where everyone feels like they have a say, and they get, they get to voice their opinion about what they want to know. And then I think you can go away and sort of work out the best way of getting to the answers to those questions. And obviously that's a sort of a big strategic, could be a big strategic thing, like where is the brand, or It could be tactical, like how are we going to market this new thing, or is there an opportunity with this new thing? But if you don't generate all the questions, then you go off on a journey, and some stakeholders might be left behind, and then they come into the process late, and they wonder why their questions weren't asked or why this thing isn't being done in a certain way. So I think this whole idea of kicking things off. I want to go back and also the qualitative a little bit. I'm also going to do a lot more detail on that. But if you think about quantitative, you've all seen surveys, you've all been administered surveys. Some of them are on LinkedIn, they're all over the place. They tend to be very short, and they're getting shorter and shorter and shorter because people have less and less time to do them. So you can't ask a lot of questions. On the contrary, qualitative can be as simple or as complex as you want it to be. I think quantitative has been sort of attentioned out to a certain degree in terms of there's a sort of a 15-minute limit on a typical quantitative survey. Whereas qualitative, what's the beauty of doing really good qualitative is it doesn't have to be a focus group. It can be a visit to someone's home. It can be looking inside the garage, seeing where the bike is stored, why is it stored there. It can be diary exercises where people fill out things on a daily basis. So you really end up with not just maybe an hour and a half, 2-hour conversation with somebody, but you have a real sort of a tapestry of their lives, and you really understand how your brand, product, etc. fits into their lives, which is one of the beauties of being able to do qualitative.
Those are great points, Ed. Thank you. Eve, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to piggyback off what Ed was saying, I think I, of course, have a biased opinion, but when it comes to quant, I feel like the numbers can often be beguiling, and it gives a sense of security that that maybe isn't underpinned by really robust understanding. And to Ed's point as well, I think the methodological toolkit within the qualitative space, you can get so creative. My colleague Brian, we did we do a quarterly kind of pet project on, just keeping our finger on the pulse of culture, and we were researching motherhood in the midst of the pandemic. And my colleague Brian had a really genius idea, which was to create like a hotline. So we had all these moms with babies and kids and just, up to their eyeballs with responsibilities. And this methodological innovation was so brilliant just because it allowed them to kind of come to the table on their own terms rather than us demanding their time. So at a 2 a.m. feeding, they could pick up the phone and call us, and it was a hotline to nowhere, and they could just, vent, dump all their feelings. But it really allows you to kind of meet people where they're at and not really demand too much time, or fit in a way that feels organic and natural rather than them having to sit at the computer for 30 minutes and click through a survey that, maybe they're not thinking too hard about, for example.
That's great.
And to return to your initial question, Peter, I think communication throughout the whole process is key. Understanding where people are coming from, the motivations behind the research. Of course, people will have conflicting needs and desires. So making sure that the research is being thought through and appreciated from all these different perspectives. And also we find hypothesis sessions really useful too, just to kind of begin thinking about what the answers could be so that there's something to test against when you're going through the research process.
Yeah, those are great answers, both of you. And I always want to go into these processes thinking about, like, what problem are we trying to solve? Can we all agree in the room here that here are the 1 or 2 or 3 problems we're trying to solve with this process? So we're talking about research. We're talking about mostly qualitative research, which is deeper interviews with stakeholders or customers. How do you guys find people to interview, whether they're, and again, like, it's not only like paying customers of a retail brand, it could be partners, it could be sponsors of an event. There are a lot of different kinds of research. I had one client, which was a whole group of 5,000 optometrists. And so it was a group purchasing organization. And so that was interviewing doctors to get their optometrists to get their kind of understanding on how the group purchasing organization could be better. How do you find and organize and get people to interview or talk to?
Yeah, because we often do consumer research, people who kind of interact with the brand on a very daily, quotidian kind of level. We try to cast as wide a net as possible while still meeting the essential requirements of needing to use the brand at least once a month, that kind of thing. But we find that getting a diverse a sample as possible really helps to strengthen the insights, because we know that they're coming from lots of different kinds of people, whether that's someone who has kids, someone who lives with roommates, with age, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, and especially trying to go to and visit places, because we do a lot of in-home research, to places that are maybe overlooked, smaller cities, third-tier cities, because I feel like that's actually an average point of view, whereas your New Yorks, your Los Angeleses, urban dwellers pull a lot of weight, but I don't know that they're always super representative of most people.
Ed, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, what I would say is what we're generally trying to do in terms of recruiting and finding people is to avoid the people who are professional respondents. So if you go to a facility, if you use a giant recruiting firm, they have a massive database, and they literally search their database for the criteria that you're looking for. Must ride a bike 3 times a week, must be aged over 35, must make 100,000 a year. They search their database, they find these people, and they bring them into focus groups. And the reality is that sometimes these people do a lot of these things. And you sort of get this problem of the professional respondent, which is they know how the game works, they know what they're supposed to do, they want to collect their $60. And so we want to try and work hard to kind of avoid that potential problem. You can do pre-screening, you can find, I did a lot of work on Mini. I spent a decade working on the BMW brand Mini, and we did a lot of non-traditional work. We spent a lot of time with clubs, with the Mini owners clubs, driving around with them, eating lunch with them, and understanding actually the kind of the psychology of why they were in a community to begin with, and what it meant to them. And that particular project, we learned so much. We actually laddered it up into a big quantitative study, where what we were trying to do is understand brand commitment. So we had actually found a way to statistically model commitment to the brand. And we found that actually being a member of a club, as in a Mini owners club, correlated really strongly with brand loyalty. If you were a member of a club and you did certain things about modifying your car, you were 3 times more likely to repurchase a Mini than the average Mini owner. But we understood that, first of all, through qualitative and spending time with these owners clubs and understanding the psychology of why people were in those groups. So you've got to hunt around and find really interesting people, and then look to the edges, look to the extremes. That's another way to go if you're trying to understand the boundaries of your category, or what they could be. Maybe it isn't the average consumer you want. Years and years and years ago, I did a project on apples, which my client at the Washington Apple Commission told me was the most boring fruit in the fruit bowl, and that we could tell him nothing new about apples. So we took apples away from people who loved apples, and we came back a week later and asked the parents and the kids to tell us what they missed so much about them. There's another very famous piece of research that was done with VW Beetle, taking beetles away from owners and giving them a rental car. And basically, this is pre-iPhone, a sort of dictaphone. And every time they missed not being in their Beetle, they would record a message. And there's as part of this research, the insights that the agency came up with was the high school principal saying she was anonymous in her bland beige white rental car, and that every time she came and pulled into the parking lot when she was driving her yellow Beetle, she wanted to be noticed, and now she was invisible, and et cetera, et cetera. So lots of things you can do: finding the right people, finding interesting people, using tools, text messages, recontacting, diaries. So I think it's just trying to avoid the low commoditized focus group where it's just a machine that is doing the recruiting. They're taking people into a bland, fluorescently lit focus group facility with M&Ms in the back room, and it's just sort of sterile and mechanized, and it's not going to make the getting great stuff.
Thanks, Ed.
And just to piggyback, if I may, Peter.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. And, the industry saying is garbage in, garbage out. So really, at least I see the recruiting phase of the process spelling out the real potential for success. Because once you have really brilliant people to work with, they're going to be the ones who are supplying the raw data that helps get to those brilliant insights that help tell you why apples are the sexiest fruit in the whole bowl.
Good point. One of the things I like to do when I'm doing research, like for a consumer brand, is also talk to people who are not using that brand, who like you feel like are in the demographic. They should be wearing Lululemon. Why are you not? You should be wearing Nike running shoes. I'm just curious, why are you not? Oh, you didn't know about them. You don't like the product, whatever it is. And I find that is always interesting to put in the mix, a few of those. And sometimes also some kind of industry insider who can kind of give you a little like big picture context about what's going on out there sometimes is interesting. Ed, you mentioned like, sometimes paying people. Eve, I would ask, do you normally pay somebody something, even a gift card, to be, to be an interviewee? And how many people or interviewees do you put together for a given project? Is it 5 people, 10, 20, 50? Like how many people do you interview?
Yeah, I can start. We of course pay people. And it's not only to make it worth their while to incentivize them to actually, give us quality time and energy, but just as a kind of standard practice of qualitative research, and especially because the brands that we work with often have big budgets, it would be a crime, I think, to expect people to give of themselves for nothing in return. And as far as numbers go, for qual, you need fewer people because you're going so much deeper with them. So we start out typically online. We'll sort of cast a wider net, ask broader questions, kind of find out where the edges of the sandbox are. And that could be anywhere from 30 to 50 people, depending on how many markets. And then once we kind of winnow down and find our all-stars, we might spend a week with 3 or 4 people to really dig deep with them.
So that's interesting, Eve. You're talking about kind of a pyramid, like you start out with whatever 30 to 50 here, and then you spend successively more time with smaller groups of people.
That's right.
I get that. I have found that like at about 15 or 20 interviews, you start hearing the same things coming up over and over. And those are great. Those are the really key insights that I highlight. and keep track of. And we're going to get to how we keep track of stuff in a minute when we talk about tools. Ed, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, at the end of the day, you can get hold of anybody. I mean, and I'm talking of, I mean, I've managed to get hold of sort of captains of industry. If you pay them enough and you give them the right environment, you know, you book a hotel suite in, you know, the Plaza Hotel. If you want to talk to the CEO of a tech company, if you want to talk to CTOs, you know, you do something similar in Silicon Valley. So it's possible to get hold of anybody you want. So, you know, incentives do make a difference. I'll just give you an anecdote. Richard Branson was, when he was running his airline, the biggest incentive you could get as a flyer on Virgin Atlantic flying first class was to be invited for the weekend to Necker Island or to Branson's place in the UK. He invited his best customers because he wanted to know what they thought. And I just love that story because it shows an individual, a corporate leader who really wants to know what his customers think. And, you know, you know, our marketing team, when I worked on Mini, were the same. You know, we'd be constantly buying people dinners to learn from them. We even did every couple of years, we do a road trip across America with 2,000 Mini owners. And we'd be doing frequently on that journey, we'd be doing frequently dinners and breakfasts and stuff with sitting down with people. We'd already had an event. So we had a captive audience. We didn't need to pay them. We just bought them a meal. So some of you guys do events. And so maybe there is an opportunity. I'm not sure if you've ridden in a 300-mile bike race, if you want to be spending another couple of hours after riding 300 miles talking about a brand, but maybe there's ways.
Yeah. And, you know, I would say in my experience, I work on a lot of sort of passion-based brands like sports, running, cycling, and I've mostly not paid interview subjects because in these really passionate brands, if people feel strongly about the brand, they actually want to come talk to you. Like they act, and one thing I've learned is on a, you know, sort of small to medium sized brand, just by getting out and interviewing a lot of super passionate, like super users of that brand is in itself an act of marketing because people want to be, a lot of people just want to be listened to. And when you go out to kind of the tribal leaders of your tribe, if you're a brand that is so lucky to have a tribe, the fact that you're listening to them is super important to them, and that alone is already a good kind of marketing tactic for a small group.
Peter, I would add a couple of things. I think you're absolutely right. If you have an in to a passion group, you know, I remember one of the first projects I did was for Reebok, and they sent me to the national cross country to go and talk to runners, and we didn't pay anything. The other thing I think is really interesting is to do what I call conflict groups. So you have the passionate fans of one brand and you have the passionate fans of another brand. So if you've always worn Nikes to run and you've got a group who always wear Asics, well, have them battle it out. It's fascinating.
Right. Interesting. Wow. Very interesting.
You're going to have them argue the case for each brand almost as if they were in court.
I love that. That's great, Ed. Thank you. Eve, I just want to ask you, okay, so let's say you got a group of 20 people you're going to interview, whether you've paid them or not, they're excited to talk to you. How do you actually do the interview? How does that work? What are the mechanics of it? Are you doing it on phone, in person? Do you write questions at first? Do you allow them to kind of go off script and take a left turn somewhere? How does that work?
Yeah, typically when we are starting out online, it's sort of like a diary bulletin board kind of thing. And that's all pre-programmed questions that they go through, respond at their leisure. Once we're in person with them, we'll sometimes do an intermediate phase. We'll do a face-to-face video interview just because there's so much that happens in terms of body language, just nonverbal communication that is really important to capture. But then when we go in person, we of course have discussion guides, but these are really directional. Part of our philosophy is that when we come to the table in a truly agendaless way, people show us what's important to them, and then we're able to kind of figure out where brands can serve them within those contexts that already matter to them, rather than trying to do it backwards and making brands important. So it's really about mapping the various contexts of life and seeing where they're struggling, where they might need help, what's actually important to them, and letting them guide the conversation in many ways in order to figure out where brands can fit. Because I think what a lot of brands tend to get wrong is that, they're working on this stuff every day professionally. So of course they're going to think that their brand is really important. But whether it's Colgate or Crest doesn't really matter for most people. It's about, brushing my teeth means my mental health is okay right now, or it means caring for my children. So it's really about finding what those higher order pieces of meaning are, and then connecting brands to them rather than thinking that brands are important in the first place.
Eve,
Yeah,
can you give me a case study of a brand you've worked with and how you've just like the rough discussion guide, like what's the rough direction? How do you set that up? Can you give me an example?
Sure. Well, we'll start the conversation by understanding a bit about who they are. Where do you live? What do you do? What does your day-to-day look like? And then we'll move into kind of a category discussion. So if it's, for example, I'm starting a yogurt project pretty soon. So understanding how they eat in general. What do meals look like? What does snacking look like? Basically, how does food show up throughout an average day? And then kind of steering the conversation toward dairy, for example. So narrowing it slightly, and then getting into yogurt itself.
Great.
Yeah.
That's great.
So
Ed,
again,
I know.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to talk a couple about Eve's point. We discussed a bit in our pre-call. I think you said life first, brand second.
yeah.
Right. So you're trying to work from the top for as long as you can. Like, right. Just even when you think about food, do you have a philosophy on food? Do you have an approach? I did a lot of work for Chipotle a few years ago, and it was a lot of ethnography, going to people's homes. And as soon as a kid was born, the family diet changed. It was just absolutely fascinating. And even in refrigerators, you'd see that's all the kid stuff, that's all the organic stuff, and then my stuff's the kind of stuff with the chemicals in it. So I want to contradict myself. At the beginning, I said about generating a lot of hypotheses and questions by having all stakeholders. You really have to interpret that into a discussion guide, because if you just take that as a list, you could be in a real danger of sort of running a quant survey in a qualitative environment. So to keep it loose, to keep it discussion led, to keep it conversational is really, really important. How many times have we been to a focus group where we've seen a senior manager point at a respondent saying, "I told you so, guys. I told you back in the office, we should have never made this product yellow." What is Mark saying? He's saying, "I hate it because it's yellow." And he goes back into the office and said, "We did a focus group." How many focus groups did he go to? He went to one. He heard one respondent validate his hypothesis. And it's kind of like the worst possible way to do a focus group, because you're narrowing in on a tactic. You're using focus groups to propel people's individual, personal, political agendas inside organizations, which is never a good way to go. So as we're thinking about the whole idea of making it conversational, making it about life, recognizing that we overstate the importance of brands, and we really want to know how they fit in people's lives, which is somewhere down the to-do list, 20 deep, in reality.
Those are great points, Ed. Thank you. One of the things I've found, is that I usually, there's a certain art to interviewing. It's like conversation. I usually start the conversation with more concrete questions and then get kind of looser and more free form as I go through. And I will often end up with, you know, what's going on out there that we're not seeing? Like, what are you seeing in the world? And by the time they get kind of warmed up, then they can kind of start really riffing with you. The other thing is I find sometimes I start tweaking my either just the questions or the way I'm interviewing as I go through the process, because you're learning, it's iterative. And I was sharing with Ed and Eve that 2 years ago, I did a research project for a big fitness brand. And all of the respondents felt very kind of sensible, frugal, introverted. And so I started in the middle of the process. I added a question, which was like, hey, I'm just curious, what kind of car do you drive? And it was out of like 30 people, it was like 25 of them drove Toyotas. It was like Toyota, Nissan, Toyota, Honda, Toyota. It was unbelievable. And it just backed up how kind of frugal and sensible they were. And I just found it to be fascinating. So, okay. So,
Peter, if I may, I just want to highlight the point you made about the iterative process. I think that's so important because as you're going through this, you're learning to ask better questions. It's not that you're getting answers necessarily, but you're learning which questions are actually important and how to ask them in a way that's going to unlock the most for you.
Right.
And
exactly.
that's super important.
Great. Okay, so let's say, okay, now you've done a bunch of interviews. How do you how do you develop insights from how do you take hey, we've done 35 interviews. I've got all these Google Docs with answers from like discussions or recordings. How do I go from there to hey, here are the 6 things we learned or whatever the number is? How does that process happen?
I think data analysis, you can do it lots of different ways. People have published hundreds of textbooks about this stuff. But my preferred way is like pretty DIY, organic. I really like to mind map. So that means, giant sheet of paper. I like being tactile is really valuable for me. It just helps me think in a different way than kind of just chugging away on the computer. But I'll start putting sticky notes, things that kind of jumped out at me throughout the conversation and kind of organizing different trends and patterns. Because what it really is pattern recognition. But it's just coming up and seeing a really compelling pattern that's going to kind of, make the story pop ultimately and hopefully get you somewhere that's interesting and unexpected rather than the sort of like banal stuff that you could do without conducting research at all.
Eve, I think that's such a great point about pattern recognition. Like that is at the core of it. Absolutely. And I also agree with the tactile thing. I end up printing out a lot of the interviews and kind of like highlighters and paper on a table. And I feel exactly the same way. Ed?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to some old-fashioned discipline of going back to your objectives. You shouldn't start a research project unless you have clear objectives that everyone's signing up to. Why are we doing this, right? And obviously there could be so many different ways. I mean, the reasons and objectives. I mean, a lot of the time, and we haven't even talked about stimulus material because that's a huge topic in its own right. So often we take something in. It could be a design for a new bike, a new shoe. It could be an ad or an ad-like object. It could be something we want people to react to, or we could get people to make something like, again, in our pre-call, one of the worst categories or the most challenging categories to do any type of consumer research with is health insurance. So a good way to have a conversation about health insurance is to not have a conversation about health insurance, is to have a conversation about life, but maybe to do an exercise where you get people to make their own health insurance company, their ideal, their kind of nirvana. And so, in a lot of cases, you are going back to your objectives, but you're also, what do people develop? What's the commonality? What do they look like? What do these things look like? What do people say about them? So, yeah, I mean, this is an interesting question from Patrick here. How do you avoid pattern recognition becoming a confirmation bias process or actually perpetuating a pattern in how you ask questions? Really good question.
Yeah, I was actually just typing a response because Julia mentioned something similar further up in the chat. And this is an entire discipline, of course, and learning to ask how to ask questions is super important. But my typical rule of thumb is keeping it as open-ended as possible, asking how, in what way, because then you're allowing people to kind of answer the question in a way that's not you know, a yes or a no, or it's generative. You can ask follow-up questions, and the task is really to understand it through their eyes, rather than yeah, trying to confirm your pet theory. And I think
yeah,
Eve,
a great
I would,
point.
Patrick, it's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. And it gets to the art of interviewing, which is not just asking leading questions, right? For instance, hey, what kind of running shoes are you wearing on your weekend long runs? Well, that makes an assumption that they even do weekend long runs. They might not. And so rather than like, what kind of shoes are you wearing when you exercise or whatever. And to Eve's point, like a more open-ended how or why approach allows people to kind of bring in their own answer and point of view. Does that make sense, Ed?
Yeah, exactly. And it also goes back to the problem with professional respondents, because professional respondents have trained themselves to tell you what they think you want to hear.
Yeah.
And, you know, one of the things I think is really fascinating is if you do this multi-layered work, you know, we're all full of contradictions. You know, that's humanity, right? I mean, I think it's interesting to ask somebody why they said something that contradicts with all actual behavior. So you said what you said in the interview that you did this, but it's interesting when we went to your refrigerator, we saw why. Sometimes people feel compelled to make a social response in front of other people. So that can be another dangerous thing. Are they saying something that they just want other people in the room to hear, or are they saying something that's true to them? So again, people who are skilled and do a lot of this can see these red flags. You know, they can see this. And again, if you go deep and you've done a diary, it's very interesting to see these contradictions and how they manifest themselves, and to kind of work out, maybe it is a contradiction. Maybe it just is the fact that, you know, I do have a 5-gallon tub of ice cream, but I told you I eat healthy most of the time. That's just who we are, right?
I feel attacked, Ed.
You know, and one of the things you're reminding me is sometimes when a brand does research internally, like they have somebody on their marketing team do the interviews, what I have seen is some people are conflict averse and they don't want to offend somebody at the brand. So like I'm looking at Mario Miller here from Canyon, for whom I have done a lot of customer research. And one of the advantages I have is I'm a little bit of an outsider. I'm working for Canyon, but I'm not technically a Canyon employee. And so people are okay. Not that there's a lot of bad news about Canyon because they're great bikes, but people are okay being honest with a third party in a way that they might not directly with a representative from that business.
It's interesting. I mean, the kind of rule is that when you're doing focus groups, you have to say who you represent.
Yes.
You have to introduce yourself. So you usually are saying if you're an independent contractor that you're working on behalf, but you don't represent.
Yes.
I mean, I've done a lot of work where we said that, and then at the end we brought the client into the room.
Yeah.
Which is you know, can be really interesting for the client to talk directly to their respondents and for them to kind of vent at some things they want to vent at. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the objectivity is a massive advantage.
Great. Okay, I want to move us along, and because the clock is ticking. So Ed and Eve, let's say, so now you've recruited the interviewees, you've done 25 or 30 interviews, you've laid them all out on a table or pinned them on the wall, and you kind of have come up with, I don't know, 3 to 5 to 10 kind of patterns and key insights that you've seen. How do you kind of package that and sell that to your team at your business or your client, if it's client work? Like, how do you put that together and sell that kind of up the line all the way to hopefully the CEO?
The tack that we take it further and further is to package everything into a narrative, a story, because we believe that that's how people best learn, and it's how we trade information. It's kind of how we think at a very primal level. So our reports will have a narrative arc. They'll have characters, just like any story would, and it really helps to first set the stage for where people are at, the world as it stands right now, since that's of course always changing, and maybe a primary influence on kind of how people are doing at any given time. And then talking about our people, who they are, what makes them special and unique, and then where the category and the brand fits within that larger landscape. And of course, every project has different questions to be answered, but that general framework we find is a really effective way of communicating information. And we also will produce a film with every report. So we'll have, the deck that we write, but the film really serves to bring actual people to life. So typically it's a 10 to 15 minute mini documentary highlighting a few people's lives. And it's really impactful because reading a quote on a slide is completely different from hearing and seeing someone say it in their kitchen or what have you.
That's a great idea. Ed, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, bringing people along for the ride. It goes back to, like, we're going on a journey. We want stakeholders involved. We want to have an ongoing dialogue. So it doesn't come as a surprise. I mean, historically, agencies have been good at the sort of unveiling moment. We're going away for 4 weeks and we're going to tell you what we find. But I don't think that works anymore. I think you've got to have a bunch of stakeholders you're working with who feel like they know where this thing is heading and they're not surprised and they're confident. The other thing I would say is we're in a very interesting time right now. We're talking about biases. We're talking about political correctness. The reality is that the world is quite a negative place. I've been hearing in the last 3 or 4 weeks this whole notion of haves and have-nots again. The people who are gliding through this kind of economic challenges, and then the people who are seriously challenged. We are finding and we're hearing a lot of difficulty in people having with hearing bad news. It's part of the COVID thing. We sort of reached the threshold of we can't take it anymore. And that doesn't matter whether you're sitting in a client meeting or whether you're reading the news. It's the same thing. So trying to find the positivity. Where are the shafts of light, and where is the positivity? Because you want to lead in with positivity, and you want to identify it. Because I got to tell you, I've done enough health insurance focus groups to tell you it's a pretty dark place, health insurance. And so how do you recast it, and how do you find ways in that are positive? And I think that's pretty apropos to the current zeitgeist. It's a challenging time to be telling difficult stories to people who don't want to hear difficult stories.
Great.
Yeah. I do think there's a balance to be struck as well, because I think people can smell bullshit a mile away. And so it's a matter of not taking a Pollyanna approach, but acknowledging that it is difficult and still revealing those glimmers of hope, to your point, Ed.
Eve, you brought up a point this week when we were talking. I was telling you a story about I had done a bunch of research for a financial technology client and kind of like done the presentation with the CEO and not really pre-sold it. And he really had a problem with one part of it. Even it wasn't a problem with my research, it was how he reacted to it, but I should have pre-sold it to him. And you had a very good point about pre-selling the insights before you get to the big fancy presentation with the whole company.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there should be no surprises in that meeting, at least from my experience. And I think there's different ways to do that. Sometimes it's, weekly check-ins. This is what we're hearing. Here's a top line report. That's kind of the pre-report or the structure of the narrative so that everyone can sign off on it, feel good about it. And then, so when you're doing the song and dance at the end, it's going to be a hit because, I've been in that position before and it's terrifying.
It's uncomfortable.
Yeah,
I know one of the things you brought up about using a video or a quote to sell your insights, I think is incredibly important. I always, when I'm presenting my insights, back it up with 1 or 2 and 3 real quotes from real people with their name, because that takes it out of the realm of like, oh, Peter, that's just your opinion. No, this is real, like empirical data. This is science. You can't really argue with it. And I think that is that's one of the most important things about research is like, it's kind of like, it's a truth. Just before we get to a few questions, Ed and Eve, one of the things I see sometimes at the conclusion of research, I have my own opinion about this, but I want to ask you, is the whole idea of constructing a persona. Like, here's your average customer. Like he's 28 years old. He runs 4 times a week. He likes to run marathons. He's married with 1 or 2 kids. Like that kind of like straw man persona, kind of conclusion. Like, how do you guys feel about that?
It's very hard to do qualitatively because you're just not talking to enough people.
Yeah.
In my opinion, to have that mean anything valuable.
Yes.
So you end up doing segmentations and then maybe appending that with qualitative. And again, for the segmentation, again, really hard to do because you've got to ask a lot of questions to people who don't want to be asked a lot of questions, but you can do it well. You can also use some really interesting online data sources to try and get at this profiling. But I think you just want to try and avoid the generic, the brand of generic or the completely unbelievable.
Yeah.
No one exists who has this profile.
Right.
Yeah, I think they can be useful, especially when you want to take the research and turn it into something that an entire organization can use and design against. But I think the pitfall of segmentations of these personas is that they can quickly become really flat, really two-dimensional, and really meaningless. Right. And especially, I've had a number of experiences where the people that that we recruit that are real brand diehards, maybe they don't totally match the persona on a page. Or maybe it puts the blinders on in a way that isn't always useful. And it's to Ed's much earlier point, the fringes are typically where you can find a lot of value. So I think it can narrow the aperture in a way that is not very useful.
Great. Okay, I agree with all of that. Okay, I want to just in the final, let's say, 10 minutes here, kind of go to some of the questions. And I know we've gotten some questions in advance and some here during the chat. Patrick, Steve, Fleck, you guys have asked similar questions about like, who are the customers? How do you segment who to interview? Which groups do you interview? And I know, like Patrick, you just asked, how do you separate the enthusiast from the target ideal customer respondent? And so there's a 2-part question here is, number one, who do you choose to interview? and because customers can mean a lot. I interpret customers as somebody who writes your brand a check, and that could be all different. That's could be vendors of any kind, subcontractors of some kind. It could be sponsors, partners, retail customers. I mean, there are a lot of kind of there, and you might need to do research with all of them or only one group. And Eve and Ed, do you have a comment about one, who do you interview? And two, how do you separate like the super fan from like the more general customer?
Yeah, I mean, well, look, super fan could be a real trap for anyone working in sports. The people, the runners running 60 miles, 70 miles a week are not necessarily representative of the broad scale of the marketplace. So, I guess sometimes you want to talk to those people because you can learn a lot from them. But again, it goes back to the beginning. What is our objective? What are we trying to do here? Are we trying to understand how to position our brand against the enthusiast, or how to position them against the mass market or the broader market? There's people who are running 20 miles a week and don't give a damn what's happening at the Diamond League meet or who wins the New York Marathon or whatever. So it just goes back to the beginning of understanding what it is you're trying to do and why, and that kind of informs who you go talk to.
Yeah, and I think understanding that different types of people will help you answer different questions. So the diehards are going to tell you something about the brand that the average user won't be able to, and then the average user will be able to provide a perspective that isn't so maniacal or myopic or single-minded, let's say.
Yeah. Those are good points. And, a follow-up customer question we just got from Lindsay was, I work in marketing. I've proposed many times that we do calls and interviews with customers, specifically when sales aren't where they need to be. I had one client tell me he's been running this company for 25 years and he knows the customers. I like the idea of bringing people along for the ride, but how do you convince owners/clients to do the research and interviews? Great question. I've heard those same things. Ed, Eve, what do you say to that?
Well, look, who does the owner think his customers are, right? Maybe you want to challenge that assumption with their own data and say, there's a pretty good story of Harry Shaving. I know somebody did a lot of strategy work with Harry's in the early days. The guys who founded the company were Ivy League grads. She asked the question, who's your target market? It's people like us. She goes back and tells them there's 150,000 people in America who are people like you, or something, a low number. That's not a scalable billion-dollar business. You've got to widen your aperture to build a sufficient business of scale, which means you need to talk to more than just Ivy League people. Well, who are those people? So I think, when you have someone who's like, I know who my customers are, well, get them to tell you who they think the customers are, and either tell them that that's not in fact who their customers are because you have data that says otherwise, or that you say that's a limited opportunity based on the potential of the product or service. I think it's being provocative and challenging these assumptions.
Yeah, and I think there's also a point to be made for, how do you invite new people in? Because there are, of course, always going to be brand loyalists, but also it's a matter of understanding the landscape enough such that you're able to court new people, new groups, and make it relevant to them as well.
And I will tell you, one of the things I've seen and done, like if you're part of a brand, like if you're on the marketing team of a brand and your CEO, let's just say, just won't go for it to approve it, I'm not averse to just going out and you doing that on your own and coming back, make it very casual. Hey, I just talked to 15 or 20 customers. Can I just share with you what I learned? Like that's one way to do it. Another is as part of another project. Like sometimes when I'm doing client work, the clients don't want to pay for, let's say, strategy. Like, hey, we just want a new brand identity and a logo. And so, or we want a marketing plan. We don't need to do the strategy work. And so I'll just kind of build it into the brand identity work, but then I will go out once the job is awarded and I'll go and interview 15 or 20 customers and I'll start there. And then once you've done it, they can't argue with it. And they actually, it's really important for them to see the insights. But sometimes you don't wait for permission, just ask for forgiveness later. Sometimes that works.
Yeah, I love that point too, Peter, because I think, brand insiders have an idea of what their brand means to people in the
Yes.
world, but it's usually, that brand identity is happening, is emergent, is not being controlled by the brand itself. It's coming through in the lived experience of its customers.
Right.
And it's kind of like language in that way. Like, of course, you have a grammar textbook, but that's not really how language is used in real life.
Yes. Okay, last two final questions. I know a few people asked in advance about any tools that you use in customer research. Ed or Eve, are there any tools, digital or otherwise, that are indispensable for you and would be helpful to people here who might not know about them?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, we live in a tech, it's a cliche. Everyone's got a smartphone. I think thinking about the smartphone and how you can use text messaging to gather some like pre-work, ask people some questions. Maybe that's for selecting respondents. You can use it. Maybe it's for part of the study. So I think go be of the people and do what the people do. And if they use their smartphones and they let you use them, you've got everything on the smartphone. They can take a photo of a cereal aisle in the store if you're working on yogurts or cereal. They can take a photo of their kid eating a food or going to a theme park or whatever. All that stuff is beautiful material. And, we want to glimpse into their lives. If the only thing we see from their lives is their faces in a focus group video, shame on us.
Yeah, I fully agree, Ed. I think the beauty of qual research is that it can be as low or as high tech as you want it to be. And I do believe that, yeah, the phone is an incredible tool because it's in everyone's pocket. And even from the back end, pen and paper works just as well as a Google Doc, works just as well as any other kind of repository. And then one thing that is rather indispensable, I think, is keeping a record of the interviews, of the interactions you have. So making sure that audio recording is okay, because you remember a lot less than you hope you would at the end of an interview. So it's always great to just have a record that you can reference. Also, rev.com, it's machine transcription, but it is pretty cheap and I use it all the time.
Great. Yes, I've used rev.com as well for transcribing video or audio interviews. I will say from my point of view, one of the things I love about qualitative research is it is kind of low tech. And like Eve said, you don't need fancy tools. And I will say that I keep track on Google Docs. I usually often on a Zoom or a phone call, I will just take notes live while I'm talking. And then let's say you got a couple dozen of these Google Docs, I will highlight yellow on them. And then if I'm going to send them to anyone, I just save them as PDFs into a folder and ship all the PDFs if I want somebody else to look at them. Okay, so if there are not any more questions, I think that is pretty much it. We're going to wrap it up. Like I mentioned, I'll save the video of this. I'll save that. I'll send you like a YouTube of the video. I hope you got something out of this. I want to thank our guests, Ed and Eve, who brought so many great insights. Feel free, by the way, if you want to share your LinkedIn contact info, you can put that in the chat. And thanks to everyone for participating. I really appreciate your time and attention.
Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Peter. It was a great honor to be invited.
Thanks.
Great.
For making me part of it.
Bye, everybody.